On a frozen mountain road in Montana, a 45-year-old former Navy SEAL slowed his truck when his German Shepherd refused to look away from the storm. Through the blinding snow, he saw an elderly woman dragging a torn suitcase one step from collapse. Every instinct told him to keep driving. Strangers in the wilderness meant danger. But when he opened the door, another set of headlights appeared in the whiteout behind them. By sunrise, 3 broken lives would be under one roof, and none of them would ever be the same again. Some decisions don't just save lives. They create home. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Winter pressed down on the mountains of western Montana like a living weight, heavy snow falling sideways under brutal wind, swallowing the narrow road until it felt less like pavement and more like a white tunnel with no clear end. Jack Miller drove through it with both hands locked on the steering wheel, his old brown leather jacket creaking softly as his shoulders shifted the smell of cold leather and worn fabric filling the cab. At 45, he carried himself like a man built to endure storms, tall and solid. Broad across the shoulders, his face carved with sharp angles, a close-cropped beard dusted with gray, and eyes that rarely revealed what they held. The red and navy flannel beneath his jacket was buttoned to the collar, a gray wool scarf wrapped tight around his neck, and his faded jeans and insulated leather boots looked as if they had been worn through more winters than most men could remember. He no longer served his country, but the war had never truly released him. Silence still felt dangerous. Stillness still felt like waiting for something to explode. Beside him sat Buddy, a full-grown German Shepherd, nearing 8 years old, black and tan coat, thick and weather-hardened ears, upright amber eyes fixed on the road ahead. Buddy had the posture of a working dog, even at rest disciplined alert, the faint scar along his flank, hidden beneath dense fur, a reminder of a life that had once moved to commands and gunfire. Jack trusted Buddy more than most people. The dog had never lied to him, never abandoned him, never pretended to be something he wasn't. The windshield wipers fought the storm in a steady rhythm, barely clearing 10 feet of visibility before the snow reclaimed the glass. Jack drove without music, without conversation, letting the low hum of the engine and the howl of wind fill the space. He told himself he was just passing through, that the mountains were nothing more than geography, that the past stayed buried where it belonged. But the mind does not obey orders the way a body does. Buddy stiffened. It was subtle at first, a change in breathing, a tension in the shoulders, ears angling forward with sudden precision. Jack noticed immediately. Years of training had taught him that instincts spoke quietly before they screamed. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his voice calm, but alert eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. Buddy let out a low sound, not a bark, not a growl, something closer to concern. The dog's gaze locked onto the right shoulder of the road. Jack eased off the accelerator. The tires hissed against packed snow. Through the swirling white, something darker moved uneven and slow, too deliberate to be drifting snow, too fragile to be a tree. As the truck crawled closer, the shape resolved into a human figure. A woman. She walked bent against the wind each step, an effort, her long coat whipping around her legs, white hair escaping from beneath a wool hat pulled too low over her forehead. One gloved hand clutched the handle of an old brown suitcase, the leather cracked and sagging, the other pressed tight against her side as if holding herself together. She was small, thin, but upright, her posture stubborn rather than strong, the kind that came from endurance, not health. Jack's chest tightened. Every instinct drilled into him over decades whispered the same warning. "Don't stop. Don't get involved. Strangers in isolated places meant risk. He had survived by reading threats quickly, by trusting caution more than compassion. He had buried friends who trusted the wrong moment. The woman stumbled. Her knee buckled just slightly, but enough. She caught herself before falling, the suitcase thudding softly against the snow. Buddy let out another sound, sharper now, insistent. Jack's jaw clenched. He slowed the truck to a crawl, headlights illuminating her face as she turned toward the light. She was older than he first thought, early 60s perhaps. Her skin was pale with cold, lined but not frail. Her eyes a clear steel blue, dulled by exhaustion, but unbroken. There was pride there, and something else, a refusal to surrender even when the body begged for it. Her name, he would later learn, was Helen Carter. Jack stopped the truck. The engine idled, vibrating through the cab. Snow slammed against the doors. He sat there frozen in indecision, watching her breathe in short, uneven bursts. His mind raced through every worst-case scenario, every lesson learned the hard way. He told himself someone else would come. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility. He told himself survival meant knowing when to keep driving. Buddy whined softly. Jack exhaled breath, fogging the glass. "You're a hell of a conscience," he muttered, reaching for the door handle. The cold hit him like a physical blow as he cracked the window, instead, the wind slicing across his face. "Ma'am," he called out, raising his voice over the storm. "You can't be out here." She turned fully toward him, squinting through the snow. Her lips moved, but the wind stole her words. She took another step, then another, stubborn even now. Jack cursed under his breath and pushed the door open, boots sinking deep into the drift as he stepped out. Up close, the damage was clearer. Her hands shook inside worn gloves. Her coat was thin beneath the layers, not meant for this kind of cold. She smelled faintly of old soap and damp wool. "I'm fine," she said hoarsely when she finally spoke, the lie trembling with every syllable. "I just need to keep moving." "You won't make it another mile," Jack replied evenly, not unkind, but firm. "The next town's over 10 out." She studied him, then really looked at him, taking in the leather jacket, the gray scarf, the beard, the way he stood like a wall against the wind. "Then I'll walk faster," she said, a dry edge of humor cutting through the cold. Despite himself, something almost like a smile touched his mouth. "What's your name?" he asked. "Helen," she answered. "Helen Carter." "Well, Helen," he said, reaching for the suitcase before she could protest, surprised by how light it was. "You're about to accept a ride." Before she could respond, before the moment could settle, Buddy barked once from inside the truck, sharp and sudden. Jack turned. Through the swirling snow behind them, another set of headlights appeared, distant but unmistakable, cutting through the storm, growing slowly brighter. Jack's grip tightened on the suitcase. He stared into the white-out heart rate ticking upward, instincts snapping fully awake. He had no way of knowing if that light meant rescue, or something else entirely. Night tightened its grip over the Wyoming mountains, as snow fell heavier, muffling the world into a narrow circle of headlight and shadow. Jack Miller drove with steady restraint, the old truck, climbing slowly along a winding forest road that few people used even in good weather. Helen Carter sat quietly in the passenger seat, her thin hands resting on the battered suitcase in her lap, shoulders hunched inside her worn coat. She no longer argued, no longer pretended she was fine. Exhaustion had stripped her of pretense. The heater rattled weakly, pushing out uneven warmth, and Jack adjusted it without comment, his movements precise, habitual. He kept his eyes on the road jaw, set aware of every slip of the tires beneath them. Bringing a stranger this far into the mountains went against everything he believed in, yet turning back was no longer an option. The storm had closed the world behind them. They passed the dark outline of a roadside diner, half buried in snow, its windows black, the neon sign dead and swaying slightly in the wind. Jack slowed, then continued on. There would be no shelter there tonight. Radios crackled with warnings of closures, roads impassable plows pulled back for safety. Wyoming did not negotiate with winter. It simply endured. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, a low wooden structure crouched against the slope, like an animal built to survive. Its exterior was weathered gray roof sagging slightly under the weight of snow porch boards, uneven with age. Jack pulled the truck to a stop and cut the engine. Silence rushed in immediately, thick and unsettling. He sat still for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, the place before him, stirring memories he had buried with deliberate care. His father had built the cabin with his own hands decades earlier, a man who spoke little and trusted work more than words. Jack had inherited both traits along with the silence that followed loss. Buddy leapt down, first boots crunching softly behind him as Jack stepped out. The cold bit hard sharp enough to steal breath. Buddy circled once, nose low to the ground, tail stiff, posture alert. Jack noticed immediately. "Easy," he murmured, though his own shoulders tightened. He moved around the truck and opened Helen's door, offering his arm. Up close, she seemed smaller than she had in the storm, her silver hair escaping in wisps beneath her hat skin, pale but firm, lined by years of restraint rather than softness. She accepted his help without pride or shame, moving carefully, favoring one knee. Inside the cabin smelled of dust, old wood, and cold stone. Jack flicked on a flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark, to reveal a single large room with rough-hewn walls, a stone fireplace at one end, shelves cluttered with tools and forgotten books, and furniture left exactly where it had been years ago. Frost clung to the window panes. The air felt abandoned. Helen stepped inside slowly, her breath forming small clouds. "It's solid," she said quietly, not as praise but recognition. Jack nodded. Solid was all his father had ever wanted. Buddy moved ahead, nose pressed to the floorboards, then toward the back of the cabin. He stopped abruptly near the porch door and let out a low rumble. Jack's instincts sharpened instantly. He followed, sweeping the flashlight beam across the snow outside. There, half covered by fresh snowfall, were footprints. Adult boots. Recent. Someone had been here. Jack felt the familiar cold settle behind his ribs, the kind that came before decisions were made under pressure. He closed the door and locked it without comment. Helen noticed. "Someone else?" she asked softly. Her voice was steady, not frightened. Jack respected that. "Maybe passing through," he replied. "Storm like this, people look for shelter wherever they can." He did not say the other possibility that whoever had come might return. Buddy remained near the door, ears half erect, listening. Jack built a fire with practiced efficiency hands, moving on memory alone. When the flames caught, warmth slowly began to spread, uneven but real. Helen sat near the hearth, rubbing her hands together, the tension easing from her shoulders. The suitcase rested beside her, scuffed and worn, clearly carrying less than a life should weigh. Jack noticed and said nothing. He had learned that silence often allowed truths to surface on their own. They ate simply from what Jack kept stored away, canned soup, heated over the fire, stale crackers softened by steam. Helen ate slowly, deliberately, as if unsure when she might be warm again. After a long stretch of quiet, she spoke, eyes fixed on the flames. "I worked as a librarian," she said. 35 years. Small town. Not much excitement, but books are patient. They don't leave you when things get hard." She paused, fingers tightening slightly. I saved what I could, lived carefully, took care of my younger brother after his drinking got worse. He was never violent, just unreliable. Her mouth tightened. Until he wasn't. Jack listened without interrupting, sitting back against the wall, arms folded, the firelight carving shadows into his face. He lost his job, Helen continued, blamed everyone but himself. One night he told me I was the reason he couldn't get his life together. Next morning the landlord told me to leave, said my brother had broken things, scared people. I packed what I could and started walking. I didn't think I'd make it this far. She glanced at Jack, then her blue eyes clear. I wasn't looking for pity, just not to die out there. Something shifted inside Jack, subtle but undeniable. He had spent years believing survival meant isolation, that staying untouched was safer than being seen. Yet here was this woman stripped of everything but dignity, asking for nothing more than warmth. He realized uncomfortably that he had built his own version of exile, one with thicker walls and better tools, but exile all the same. "You're safe for the night," he said finally. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to comfort her. Helen nodded once, accepting the statement as fact rather than promise. Later, as the fire settled into a steady glow, Buddy lay between them, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the cabin something fragile and unfamiliar took shape. Not peace, not yet, but the absence of immediate danger. Jack stared into the fire, feeling the walls he had built begin ever so slightly to crack. The wind sharpened after midnight, pushing snow against the cabin walls in uneven waves, the darkness outside pressing close as if listening. Jack Miller woke instantly at the sound of Buddy's low growl, a controlled warning rather than panic, the kind that pulled Jack out of sleep the same way distant gunfire once had. He sat up slowly, heart-steady senses alert, his body already moving before thought caught up. The fire had burned low, casting faint amber light across the room. Helen Carter slept in the chair near the hearth, her breathing shallow, but even her face drawn, yet peaceful for the first time since Jack had found her on the road. Buddy stood near the back wall, body rigid, ears forward, nose lifted toward the ceiling as if scent alone had spoken a language Jack could not hear. The German shepherd's thick black and tan coat bristled slightly along his shoulders, tail still, his amber eyes focused toward the rear of the cabin. Jack rose without sound, boots sliding into place out of habit, and reached for the flashlight resting on the shelf. He did not wake Helen. Fear, he had learned, was best handled in silence. Another sound followed, faint but unmistakable. A dull scrape of metal, wood creaking under pressure. The direction was clear. The old storage shed behind the cabin. Jack moved to the back door and paused, listening. The storm muffled everything, but there was intent in the noise, something deliberate. He glanced at Buddy, who looked back once, then lowered his head slightly, a signal of readiness rather than aggression. Jack cracked the door open, cold air slicing into the room, and stepped outside. Snow reached halfway up his boots, the wind cutting sideways across the clearing. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the dark landing on the shed at the edge of the tree line. Its door hung partially open, snow piled unevenly at the threshold. Jack approached slowly, every step measured, his breath controlled. "Whoever's in there," he called out, voice low but firm, "step out where I can see you." For a moment there was nothing. Then a shape shifted inside the shed, followed by a man stepping into the light with both hands raised. He was around 50 tall, but worn-down shoulders slumped from years of carrying more than tools. His beard was thick and untrimmed brown, threaded heavily with gray, framing a face lined deep by cold sun and sleepless nights. His hair was longer than it should have been, pushed back beneath a faded knit cap. Eyes sunken, but alert, the gaze of someone used to being watched with suspicion. His clothes were layered and practical, but threadbare. A flannel shirt beneath a battered work jacket, jeans stiff with dirt, and age boots held together by effort more than leather. "I'm not here to steal," the man said quickly, his voice rough breath visible in the beam. "Just needed cover from the storm." Jack studied him in silence, the way he had studied men in places where mistakes were fatal. No sudden movements, no aggression, just fatigue and guarded resignation. Buddy stepped forward into the light beside Jack, positioning himself slightly ahead. Not snarling, not barking, simply present. The dog's posture was calm, but absolute. "What's your name?" Jack asked. "Mark Reynolds?" the man replied after a pause. "Carpenter, or I was." He swallowed. "Didn't know anyone was using the place." "I'll go." Something in the way he said it struck Jack. Not defiance, acceptance. The tone of a man prepared to walk back into the storm because he believed he had no right to stay anywhere. Mark took a step backward toward the shed, snow crunching under his boots. Before Jack could respond, a voice cut through the cold. "Don't send him away." Helen stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket Jack had given her. Silver hair catching the light, her frame thin but upright, eyes steady. She looked older in that moment, not weaker, but more certain, the kind of certainty earned through endurance rather than authority. Mark turned toward her, startled. "No one should be out there tonight," Helen continued calmly. "Not if there's another choice." Jack hesitated. Every instinct he had screamed caution. Bringing one stranger into his life was risk enough. A second in the middle of nowhere with no witnesses and no backup went against every rule he had survived by. He looked down at Buddy. The dog had not moved, had not growled, had not shown even a flicker of distrust. That mattered. "Just for the night," Jack said, finally lowering the flashlight. "You caused trouble, you're gone." Mark nodded immediately, relief flashing across his face so quickly it embarrassed him. "I won't," he said. "I swear." Inside the cabin, the warmth felt suddenly fragile, like a thing that could be broken if handled wrong. Mark stood awkwardly near the door, removing his cap, revealing hair flattened by sweat and snow. Up close, the years showed more clearly. His hands were large and scarred knuckles, thick, the hands of a man who had built things for a living. When Helen offered him a chair, he hesitated before sitting, perching on the edge, as if ready to leave at the first sign of rejection. Jack poured coffee from the old pot and handed it to him. Mark accepted it with both hands, nodding his thanks, eyes fixed on the steam rising from the mug. "Lost my wife 3 years ago," he said quietly after a long silence, not looking up. "Cancer. After that, work dried up. Jobs come and go when you don't have an address. I move where the weather lets me." Helen listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. Buddy lay down between them, his body forming a subtle barrier, not of threat but of presence. Mark glanced down at the dog, hesitated, then reached out slowly. Buddy sniffed his hand once and settled again, tail resting still. Jack watched the exchange closely. Buddy did not give trust lightly, not since the explosion years ago that had nearly ended his life. If the dog accepted Mark, Jack was willing for now to do the same. They spoke little after that. Words felt unnecessary. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, 3 broken adults sat within the same circle of firelight, each carrying a past heavy enough to bend a spine. Jack felt something unfamiliar in his chest, not comfort, but recognition. For the first time in years, the cabin was not echoing with memory alone. It held breath, warmth, and the fragile weight of shared survival. Buddy remained at the center, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed, a silent sentinel guarding something none of them yet knew how to name. Morning arrived quietly on the ridge, the storm finally loosening its grip, sunlight filtering pale and cold through the frost-laced windows, revealing a cabin no longer frozen in time, but cautiously awake. Jack Miller stood outside, splitting kindling, his breath, steady the dull rhythm of axe against wood grounding him in a way conversation never could. Physical work had always been his refuge, a place where memories loosened their hold. At 45, his body still carried strength, though it ached more now, a reminder that time did not pause for anyone, not even soldiers. Nearby, Mark Reynolds moved methodically along the porch, hammering loose boards back into place with the patience of a craftsman who trusted his hands more than his luck. Mark's tall frame looked sturdier, with purpose, his untrimmed beard catching sawdust, his lined face calmer when he focused on repair rather than survival. Inside the cabin, Helen Carter moved with quiet intention, wiping counters, stirring soup on the old stove, humming softly under her breath, the sound gentle and maternal, transforming the space into something that felt lived in rather than borrowed. Buddy watched it all from his place near the doorway, the German shepherd's thick black and tan coat catching the light amber eyes, alert, but relaxed his posture, that of a guardian who finally sensed order rather than threat. The cabin had found a rhythm, fragile but real. Mark fixed what winter had damaged, Jack kept his hands busy to keep the war quiet, and Helen stitched warmth into every corner with small, deliberate acts of care. It was not happiness, not yet, but it was stability, and for all three that felt rare. The sound of an engine broke the rhythm. Jack looked up first. A dark sedan crawled along the snow-packed road toward the cabin tires, slipping slightly before correcting. Buddy's ears snapped forward, body tensing, a low warning rumble forming in his chest. Mark straightened hammer, lowering to his side. Helen appeared in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, her expression tightening as recognition flashed across her eyes. The car stopped abruptly. A man stepped out, slamming the door harder than necessary. David Carter stood there unsteadily, 45 years old, lean but rigid shoulders hunched with equal parts anger and resentment. His thinning brown hair was uncombed, his face sharp and weathered by poor sleep and poorer decisions, jaw clenched beneath stubble that had gone days without care. A long wool coat hung crooked on his frame, and even from a distance the faint sour edge of alcohol carried on the cold air. His eyes locked onto Helen with a mix of relief and accusation. "Where is she?" David shouted, voice slurred but forceful as he stumbled toward the porch. "What have you done with my sister?" Jack stepped forward, instinctively placing himself between David and the cabin, his stance calm but immovable. "You need to slow down," he said evenly. "This is private property." David laughed sharply, bitter and hollow. "Private? You think hiding out here makes you saints?" His gaze flicked to Mark, then back to Jack. "You got her trapped. That's what this is. Some veteran fantasy, playing savior." Helen stepped forward, then her posture, straight voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "David, stop. No one is holding me here." He turned on her, eyes flashing. "You don't know what you're saying. You disappear in a storm and suddenly you're living with strangers in the mountains. You always needed someone to tell you what to do." That was when Buddy barked once, sharp and commanding, placing himself squarely between David and Helen, his body tense, but controlled. David froze, eyes dropping to the dog, then lifting again with irritation. "Get that animal away from me." Jack didn't move. He's not the problem. David's hands shook as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the cops," he snapped. "Let them see what kind of place this is." The patrol car arrived less than 30 minutes later, crunching into the clearing lights, flashing silently against the snow. 2 officers stepped out. Deputy Harris was the first mid-40s, broad-shouldered, his face calm, and practiced eyes taking in details rather than accusations. His partner, Officer Lane, younger and sharper, stayed a step behind, hand resting lightly near his belt, gaze moving between faces with measured caution. "We got a call about a possible welfare issue," Harris said, voice even as he nodded toward Helen. "Ma'am, are you here of your own free will?" "Yes," Helen answered immediately, her voice steady. "I am," David scoffed. "She's confused. She's been manipulated." Harris raised a hand, silencing him. "Sir, we'll ask the questions." His eyes shifted to Jack and Mark, then back to the cabin, noting the warmth, the order, the smell of soup and wood smoke. "Doesn't look like coercion to me." Buddy moved again, nose-twitching attention fixed not on David, but on the sedan. He walked toward the car with purpose, tail stiff, then stopped at the open trunk David had forgotten to close. Buddy barked once and sat staring. Jack followed, heart sinking as he lifted the trunk lid fully. Inside, beneath old coats, were half-empty bottles of whiskey and several prescription pill bottles. Labels, visible names, unfamiliar dosages. Alarming. Harris's expression hardened. "Sir," he said to David, "these are controlled substances." "And you drove here today?" David's face drained of color. "They're mine," he stammered. "For my back. Doctor prescribed them." Maybe Harris replied calmly, but not like this. He nodded to Lane, who stepped forward. Helen closed her eyes briefly, then spoke, her voice quiet but resolute. "He needs help, not excuses." David's shoulders sagged as the officers guided him towards the patrol car, his anger dissolving into something closer to shame. "You're choosing them over me," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm choosing myself," Helen answered softly. As the car disappeared down the road, silence returned heavier than before. Helen stood still for a moment, then exhaled, shoulders trembling as the weight of years finally shifted. Mark rested a gentle hand on her shoulder. Buddy moved closer, pressing his head against her hip, steady and warm. Jack watched the scene with a realization settling deep in his chest. He had stopped once in a snowstorm, thinking he was saving a life. Standing there now, watching Helen claim her choice, he understood something else entirely. He wasn't just rescuing people from danger. He was learning how to stay. How to let others stay, too. Spring arrived quietly on the ridge, the snow retreating in narrow rivers that exposed dark earth beneath the pines, the air softened by the scent of thawing wood and distant water. Jack Miller woke before dawn, as he always had, but for the first time in years the silence did not feel like a threat waiting to happen. He lay still for a moment, listening to the cabin, breathed the faint creak of settling beams, the steady exhale of a place that no longer felt abandoned. When he rose, he pulled on the same brown leather jacket he had worn all winter, the red and navy flannel beneath it, faded but familiar. The gray wool scarf looped once around his neck out of habit rather than need. Habit had once kept him alive. Now it simply reminded him where he was. Outside the cabin looked different. Not newer, not prettier, but awake. Mark Reynolds was already in the workshop, the low structure behind the house that had once sagged under neglect, now humming with purpose. At 50, Mark moved with the steady confidence of a man reunited with his craft. His tall frame filled the space, easily beard-trimmed back, but still rough hands, sure as they guided wood beneath a planer. The grief that had bent his shoulders all winter had not vanished, but it no longer owned him. Work had returned something essential, a rhythm that anchored him in the present, rather than the loss behind him. The sign above the workshop door, simple and hand-painted, read, Hawthorne Ridge Woodworks. The letters clean and deliberate. Inside the cabin, Helen Carter moved from room to room with quiet authority, her silver hair pinned back neatly, her posture upright, purposeful. At 62, she carried herself with the calm certainty of someone who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. She managed the small kitchen like a librarian once managed shelves, everything ordered, every item returned to its place. Mornings meant coffee strong enough to wake the house. Afternoons meant ledgers and careful notes for orders that came from town neighbors, curious about the reopened workshop, grateful for a place where things were fixed rather than replaced. Helen had become the center without trying, her presence soft but steady, the kind of warmth that did not demand attention, yet changed everything around it. Buddy lay near the door, as he always did, his thick black and tan coat shedding slowly, with the season his body heavy with age and experience. Nearly 8 years old now, the German Shepherd still rose each night to patrol the perimeter, still listened to the wind, with ears tuned to danger, but his amber eyes no longer carried the hard edge of constant vigilance. He knew his people, he knew his place. When Jack stepped onto the porch, Buddy's tail thumped once against the floor, a simple acknowledgement content rather than alert. The days fell into a pattern that none of them had planned, but all of them protected. Mark built tables, chairs, shelves the kind meant to last decades, not seasons. Jack worked beside him, sanding, lifting, repairing frames and beams that had warped with time. He spoke little, but the work quieted the echoes in his head more effectively than distance ever had. The memories did not disappear, but they no longer demanded to be relived. He discovered that fatigue earned honestly felt different than exhaustion born of avoidance. In the evenings, Helen cooked simple meals that filled the cabin with the smell of bread and soup, and they ate together without ceremony, the sound of cutlery, and the occasional dry remark replacing the weight of unspoken things. Jack noticed the change most clearly in himself during the mornings. He woke before sunrise, as always, but instead of bracing for the day, he anticipated it. The silence that once pressed against his skull now felt like space room to breathe. He still wore the same clothes, still moved with the economy of a man trained not to waste effort, but his shoulders had lowered, his jaw unclenched. He caught himself standing at the window sometimes, coffee cooling in his hand, watching light creep across the ridge, and realizing he was not waiting to leave. Buddy sensed it too. He followed Jack less closely now, content to remain near Helen, or wander toward the workshop where Mark worked, lying in a patch of sun that spilled across the floor. The dog's watchfulness remained, but it had softened into something older and wiser, the vigilance of a guardian who trusts his ground. Word spread through town slowly the way it always did. People came with broken furniture, warped doors, loose steps. They stayed longer than necessary, drawn by the warmth, by Helen's steady conversation, by the sight of a man with a scarred face and quiet hands working beside a craftsman who treated wood with respect. Jack noticed how often eyes lingered on Buddy, how children spoke to him softly, sensing his age and patience. The cabin, once a refuge from the world, had become a place the world approached gently. One evening, as the light faded and the ridge settled into dusk, Jack stood alone in the workshop, smoothing the edge of a small bench requested by a neighbor. His hands moved automatically, but his mind wandered. He thought about the man he had been before the storm, before the decision to stop on a mountain road. That man had believed survival meant motion, meant never staying long enough for attachment to form. He had been wrong. Survival, he understood now, sometimes meant staying exactly where you were. He set the bench aside and stepped outside. Helen sat on the porch with a book, glasses low on her nose. Mark nearby repairing a hinge with careful focus. Buddy lay between them, head on his paws, eyes half closed, the picture of calm. The scene struck Jack with unexpected force. Not happiness, not relief, but recognition. This was what he had been circling for years without knowing it, a place where broken people did not have to explain themselves, where usefulness mattered more than history. That night, after the lights were out and the cabin settled, Jack paused by the door. Buddy rose, padding over his presence, solid and reassuring. Jack rested a hand briefly on the dog's head fingers, sinking into familiar fur. "We're good," he murmured the words as much for himself as for Buddy. Outside, the ridge lay quiet under the stars, the world vast and uncertain beyond the trees. Inside, the cabin held warmth, purpose, and people who chose to remain. Jack understood then that not everyone found a place to return to. Some places were lost, some were never meant to be revisited. But sometimes if a person was willing to stop to open a door in the middle of a storm, a different kind of place revealed itself. Not a return, but an arrival. Not a destination, but a decision to stay. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire. They come quietly through a simple decision to stop to open a door or to let someone stay. In this story, no one was suddenly made whole. Instead, broken lives were gently stitched together by kindness, patience, and the courage to care. That is how God often works, not by changing the storm, but by placing the right people under the same roof when the storm feels endless. In our own lives, we may pass many moments where love asks us to slow down, to listen, or to help without knowing the outcome. Those moments matter more than we realize. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, compassion, and redemption. May God bless you and your family, protect you through every storm, and guide you toward the place where your heart can finally rest.